how is your soul? I want you to think about it. Think about how you're doing this morning. How have you been in the past, 7 days? How is your soul? Have you felt anxious? Have you felt stressed? Has the week been filled with maybe a low-level anger? There have been moments of explosive anger. Has your week been filled with shame? Has it been filled with, I'm not doing enough? Have you been filled with regret, self-loathing, self-hatred, maybe even depression? Have you felt like you're not sure if you want to live this past week? Maybe this week's been filled with joy. Maybe it's been filled with fun. Maybe it's been filled with none of those things. Maybe you've just felt lethargic. I bet for most of us, there's at least been a moment in this week where we felt some of those negative things. How is your soul? Well, the Apostle Peter, one of Jesus' friends, one of his closest learners, he was concerned about the souls that he was writing to. And the Greek word soul that he used might be surprising to you because the word in Greek is psyche. What does that sound like? Anyone? It sounds like psychiatrist, psychology, psyche. Because how you are doing spiritually is inextricably connected to how you are doing psychologically, how you're doing emotionally. He talks about their psyche. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you," this is verse 11, "as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." There's a war waging right now. Yeah, there's one in Ukraine, and there's been one in Palestine. There's been one, smaller ones going on in East Asia and Africa. But there's a war going on in this room right now. And it's a war for your spiritual health. It's a war for your psychological health. It's a war for your emotional health. There is a war for your soul. Now, the word evil desires really isn't the best translation because in Greek, and don't worry, you can understand the Bible without knowing Greek, but it just helps more to know a layer deeper. But the word is epithumeo. Epe means upon, thumeo means desire. It means excessive desire. Excessive desire, excessive desires. And aren't there excessive desires coming at us? Excessive desires for greed, for money, excessive desires for work, political outrage. Maybe it's for nationalism and racism. Maybe it's for doom scrolling. Maybe it's for brain rot. There's online gambling coming at us. There's sports betting. I'm sure the psyche of the Trailblazers coach is not doing very well right now, right? Probably not doing so great. There's overeating. There's online pornography. Now there's AI pornography that's waging a war at us. There's hookup culture. And those last couple things I mentioned, you go, oh, those things aren't bad. Well, actually, psychologists tell us that people who look at online pornography, people who are constantly doing AI stuff, and people who are part of hookup culture all have higher levels of anxiety, depression, lethargy, self-loathing. Those are secular psychologists saying that. But Jesus wants our souls thriving. He wants your soul to flourish. He wants you to flourish emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. Not that it's ever going to be perfect in this fallen world, but he wants you to grow. He wants you to win the war. Now, Peter calls them, if we put the verse on the screen, in verse 11, he calls them exiles and foreigners. And I've told you all throughout this series that we're riffing back to our spring series, one of the benefits of coming to church all year round. We're riffing back to our spring series about Babylon, and he's got Babylon on the brain. He's thinking of Daniel in the lion's den. If you're new to church, that's the story. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's Jews who've been ripped out of their homeland, and they're now living in Babylon. And he's writing to them as exiles and foreigners, and he's saying, think of yourself that you're just like Daniel. Think of yourself that you're just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you have to be a refugee and live in this place that's not your homeland, but he's telling these Christians, God is your true homeland. God is your true paradise. Your native country is the new creation that is coming. View your loyalty, view your allegiance as being loyal to God's kingdom. but then live as an exile and a refugee like Daniel and Shadrach and the rest in this empire. And the empire is a metaphor, we said all spring, for any kingdom that's built on excessive desire. Any nation, any empire, any institution that's built on greed and lust and pride and power. These are the empires of Babylon. And he's saying, live in Babylon, but don't fully become a Babylonian. Remember, they were willing to learn the language. They were willing to work for Babylon. They were willing to wear the clothes. They were willing to learn the religion even. But they wouldn't bow to the idols of Babylon. They had a line in the sand. Now, I've preached here before about civil disobedience, and the Bible does encourage civil disobedience. We have these two, do you know, by the way, the Exodus story, chief architects were women? I think that's kind of cool to know. Read the beginning of Exodus. There's like 5 women who initiate God's liberation from Israel. But these 2 women in particular, it said, in one of my favorite verses, it says, the midwives feared the Lord, so they broke the king's decree. Amazing, so cool. But the Bible does talk about civil disobedience. I could show you others examples. But today we're talking about Portland's favorite topic, okay? We're talking about civil obedience. Ooh, Portland loves that, right? They wake up in the morning like, how can I be a good civic servant and obey my government today? That's what everybody in Southeast is thinking this morning, I'm sure. But we're talking about civil obedience. But why does he command them to obey the emperor? The emperor is the ultimate Babylonian, right? He's Caesar Nero. He is a polygamist. He is likely a pedophile. He is burning people alive in his gardens for entertainment so he can pretend to be Hercules and ride his chariot around. Like, he's a psychopath. Why in the world is Peter writing them, telling them to honor the emperor? Well, look at verse 11. It is God's will that by doing good, you would silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. What's the ignorant talk? Well, we know some of the slanders that went around about early Christians. You see, Christians, they came to church and they had what they called agape feasts, love feasts, where they'd love one another, worship God, take communion, right? They'd eat the body and blood of Jesus. But this slander came out that they were actually committing incest, because they called each other brother and sister, that the love feasts were orgies, and that they were cannibals. They were eating the flesh of human beings, right? We take the little communion cracker, we take the little juice. Well, the rumor was they're cannibals, they're committing incest, they're having orgies, and Peter's just like facepalm, like, let's put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Like, let's silence those accusations. But the biggest accusation, far bigger than any of those, the biggest accusation was that they were committing treason against the empire. That they were revolutionaries coming together, plotting with their allegiance to their King Jesus, and that because they were loyal to King Jesus, their Lord, they were going to overthrow the true Lord, Caesar Nero. And he's writing them saying, guys, we're not revolutionaries. We're not trying to overthrow the government. We're not just one more group vying for the power. We're not using the empire's methods to overthrow the empire. We're not becoming Babylonians for the purpose of destroying Babylon. You get it? You tracking with me? He's saying, no, we're not like them. We're different. We're distinct. We're a kingdom not of this world. Pontius Pilate, you've probably heard of him, prefect who crucified Jesus. He goes, are you a king then? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would fight and overthrow you, Pilate, but my kingdom is not of this world. Now, you may be going, you know what? That's why I don't like this Christianity thing. It's weak sauce, man. It's too moderate. It's too mild. Like, now's the time to rise up. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever heard of Thaddeus? Have you ever heard of Simon Bar Kokhba? Have you ever heard of Fiscus of Crete? Hey, on December 25th, is anybody going to be singing carols to Judas the Galilean? Anyone? Are there cathedrals built to Fiscus of Crete? Who were these? These were messiahs who were brutal, violent revolutionaries. They were messiahs who tried to use the methods of Babylon to overthrow Babylon. They were Jews who tried to overthrow Rome through violence. But guess what? All of their movements are gone. But the kingdom of Jesus has outlasted the French Revolution. The kingdom of Jesus has outlasted the communist and Bolshevik revolution. The kingdom of Jesus has outlasted every violent revolution, and there's billions of people still marching to Jesus' orders when all these other bloody revolutionaries are dead and buried. So maybe Jesus knew a thing or two. Maybe we need to learn to wage his war of peace. And how does this all connect? I'll tell you why. Because although online porn is an issue and online gambling is an issue and all these other things I talked about are an issue, one thing that is vying for our affection and our attention, vying for our very souls, is the excessive desire for political power. That is the excessive desire that is often vying for our souls, not for all of us, but for many of us, and it's what Peter has in his sights today. So, Christians must wage a war of peace against the empire's lust for power and the lust for power that exists in each and every one of us. That's what we're saying. Jesus waged a war of peace and love and humility, and his empire stands where every other empire has fallen. So our first thought today is fight for the common good. Fight for the common good. Live, verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of being cannibals, though they accuse you of having orgies, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits. This is super popular verse right here in 2025, Portland, Oregon, baby. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor, whether to the guy who lives on Pennsylvania Avenue in that white building that he's destroying, literally, whether to the emperor, the supreme authority, or governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. He's giving like a basic lesson of what the government's for. It is, there's this phrase that I heard that I like so much. See if I can remember it. Basically, it's like that we've only allowed a certain part of society to have the ability to punish, to use violence for like the purpose of controlling people. Basically, like the fact that we have a police force, like that's the basic guy of government, is that like that person's trying to murder you and kill you, and then somebody has permission to come and stop him. Like that's the basic idea of government that Peter's getting at here. But a lot of people would read this in Portland and go, you know what, this is exactly why I hate religion. Because religion, it is the opiate of the people. Karl Marx had it right. This passage right here in 1 Peter is exactly what I'm talking about, is that it is the ruling class using this pie in the sky to get people to behave and to hold people in their place and to keep people down. Religion is just what colonialists use to enslave indigenous people around the world. It is the opiate of the masses. That's what a lot of people in Portland would say. And a great example of that is Desmond Tutu. You know, Desmond Tutu has a powerful quote. You know, he fought apartheid in South Africa. Desmond Tutu says this: when the missionaries came to Africa, they had Bibles and we had our land. They said, let us pray. So we closed our eyes. And when we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. Desmond Tutu, right? That's what a lot of people would say. Say, you know, it's just, Bible's just a tool of oppression. Submit to the emperor, you know, submit to those in authority. But I want to show you why colonialists who use the Bible that way were committing biblical malpractice. They were committing spiritual malpractice, and I'm going to show you. When you know the Bible's original authors, when you know the Bible's original audience, when you know the Bible's original context and intent, you see that it could never be used as an instrument of oppression. And when you're actually, using it the way the original audience understood it. First thing is this: 1 Peter was not written from a place of power and oppression. It was not written from a place of privilege. Peter wasn't in a position of privilege. Peter was a blue-collar, ethnic minority fisherman who was incarcerated multiple times and eventually executed by the state. You realize that? Let me say that to you again. Peter was an ethnic minority, a blue-collar worker who was incarcerated multiple times and then executed by the state. So the idea that the Bible is like this authority figure being written like, ha, 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 I'm an aristocrat. I know just what to write to keep these slaves in line. Like, that doesn't work. Peter gets executed by the state. He's poor. He's humble. He's a fisherman. So it really doesn't square. Now, Jesus, who was also poor, by the way, right? He lived in absolute poverty. He was born in a truck store bathroom, essentially. He was born in a feeding trough. He lives poor his whole life. But what does Peter say? Jesus says, they come to him, and he knows how to operate just like Daniel. He knows how to operate just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They say, hey, should we pay taxes to Caesar or should we not? And half the people want to overthrow Rome, and the other half people are like in league with Rome, and so they're putting Jesus in a rock and a hard place. And Jesus brilliantly, with a twinkle in his eye, and we know he's poor because he goes, hey, can I borrow a coin? I don't have any. They toss him a coin. He goes, hey, whose image is on this? He said, well, Caesar's. Then he flicks it back to them and he says, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, but to God the things that are God. And he's got a twinkle in his eye. Why? Because everyone in that crowd knew the first chapter of Genesis. This coin is made in Caesar's image, but every human being is made in God's image. Blows their minds, right? Blows them away. Jesus said to pay taxes. Pay taxes to Caesar. Give Caesar his coins, but don't give him your soul. That's what Jesus is saying. So, and you got to think about Daniel. Daniel, he doesn't have a choice in this, but he's working for Babylon at the highest levels of government. He's excelling in his career, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But at the same time, he will not bow down to Babylonian idols. And there's this great part, I believe it's in Daniel chapter 7 at the end of it. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because this wasn't in my notes. But he says, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, humble yourself and do right by the poor. He's speaking truth to power, but he's working at the highest levels of government. But you know what? One of the biggest things that wars against our souls is the internet. The internet is warring against our souls. Now there are actual crazy, like supercomputer AI. People say one day AI is going to be smarter than us. I'm like, that happened to me in 7th grade when they handed me a calculator. It's been smarter than me for a long time. But you know, now, the internet is coming for us. There's evil billionaires in Silicon Valley fighting for your soul. Do you realize that? They have a saying in Silicon Valley called lifetime value. And the more ads you see, the more other people have to pay them money. So the more time you spend on their apps, it's like cha-ching, 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 and they have something called lifetime value. There's a price tag on your soul, all right? But when we're getting all mad at each other on the internet, the truth is we're not changing anybody's minds. And I hate to break this to you, but it's just the reality. Check this quote out. This was a study from Jennifer Pan at Stanford University and Andy Guess at Princeton University. Oh, that's the wrong slide. Did the other one not go? Sometimes maybe the internet's mad at me for making fun of it. And so my Dropbox didn't work. That's too bad. Okay, sorry about that, Hannah and Maddie. This is my fault, not theirs. Okay, when we looked at whether the mix of social media content encountered and consumed, engaged with those on platforms, affected what people told us later on, we found there were negligible impacts. Downstream political behaviors like volunteering or donating for a candidate, not even a small percentage. No change in terms of voting choice. In other words, what they did in this experiment is they had people look at political content on social media, just like the normal way they would in their feed, and they're getting things that, is supposed to convince them to change their mind, convince them to change their mind, convince them to change their mind. And these researchers from Princeton and Stanford said there was zero change in how people behaved or voted. And I'm not telling you shouldn't post. You can post, whatever, that's fine. I post sometimes too. But if you just put all your energy and all your emotion and you're getting worked up and you're getting depressed and you're like, I'm going to take it down. We got to fight. We got to resist. Or maybe you're on the other side. Maybe you're super stoked with who's in the White House because there are a diversity of opinions even in this church. I just want you to know you're not really changing much, but the internet's changing you. Your posts aren't changing much out there, but it's changing a lot in here. And so I'm not telling you to never oppose them. I'm just saying it doesn't change people's minds. And Silicon Valley is getting value out of us. Now, and the other thing I want to say is don't let it destroy your real relationships. Because we all have family members who disagree with us, don't we? We all do. We all have family members that are like, oh, he's the awesome Babylonian guy. Yeah, he's the best. And then other people are like, no, Babylon is evil. No, resist. We both have that. We also have it in here. Newsflash, if you're looking for a church that's all red or all blue, you've come to the wrong place. Because the truth is, I follow all of you on Instagram. Maybe not all of you. And I see, well, these people aren't going to get along very good. I see that there's a difference of opinion even in this room. But I want to challenge you to stay put. Want to know why? Because our allegiance should be to Jesus, not to Babylon. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, but to God the things that are God, right? In Jesus' band of 12 disciples, there are these two names that I love. The first one is Matthew the tax collector. And he was a traitor to his own people, collecting taxes for Rome, exploiting people like a mob boss, sending out his thugs to collect on the team of Rome. But then there's a second name, okay? And the second name is Simon the Zealot. Want to know what the Zealots did? They kept knives in their sleeves, and they would go up to Roman officials and stab them, like prison shank, sewing machine. It's pretty brutal. Anyways, and walk off. They wanted to overthrow the Romans. How are those two going to get along? We've got a traitor on the side of the Romans who oppresses people. We've got a revolutionary zealot who wants to kill the Romans. And they're both in love with Jesus. And Jesus changes both of them. And I'm sure it wasn't easy because we know from the Gospels the disciples were extremely prideful. They were always arguing. They were hotheads, but they managed to stick it out. And I want to invite you to stick it out. But some people will hear me say, Jesse, you're too moderate. Now's the time. There's never been a time in history like this. We got to stand up and fight. I just want to ask you a question. Was the government publicly executing anybody on your drive to work this morning? It is without a doubt fact that every Israelite had seen people crucified in their lives. Have you ever watched a public execution? Well, then I think we're doing okay. I think if Matthew and Simon can be friends and follow Jesus, we can all be friends and follow Jesus too. And newsflash, you think, well, no, if we just get the right person into DC, everything will be better. Everything will be okay. I'll just feel so much more at peace. If we just get the right people into the White House, into the Congress, into the Supreme Court, then everything will be all right. I got newsflash. Whenever that happens, what's going to happen to the 150 million people who disagree with you? Are they going to suddenly disappear? Are they suddenly going to vanish from the planet? All your problems will still be there. So how about you learn to love your neighbor instead? Learn to love your neighbor. And I'm not saying that the issues don't matter. I'm just saying that when you take a good thing and you make it an ultimate thing, it becomes an idolatrous thing. A desire is good. Political desires are good. But when a desire becomes an excessive desire, that's when you're not following Jesus anymore. You're following an idol. All right. So something else is crazy about this is that the New York Times says that things have gotten so severe in our culture that there are people on both sides of the aisle calling for a political divorce, a national divorce, that we've reached the point of irreconcilable differences. But here's the thing. Last time I looked, there's people in houses even around here. It's like, how are we going to divide things up? The only way to divide up a national divorce is a civil war. And there's people calling for civil war, and people who think that's cool. I don't think we have any concept of how brutal a revolution would really be, of infrastructure collapsing, of just, you're worried about the SNAP benefits? We should be worried about that. Imagine how many people will starve to death in the middle of a civil war. And I think it's interesting that back in the 70s, we got no-fault divorce laws saying, I can't unify with you, there's irreconcilable differences. Well, who knew that the family was the basis of society, and now we're reaching the point where society wants a divorce? And it leads to destruction. But I want to quote Dr. King here, we must learn to live together as brothers, or we shall die together as fools. We got to learn to live together. And what if counterculture came together? And I'm just being real here. And this is not a critique of anybody. We were raising money for Snap. We got like 130 shares. Oh, I feel so good about myself. I posted in my story. And we got like 10 donations. And that's what Instagram does to us. Like, I did my part, I posted. Man, if every social media post for any topic was an actual donation, world hunger would be over. You know what I mean? Like, all the issues would be solved. But here's my pitch for the vision of counterculture. What if and it kind of already is, what if counterculture was a place where there's red and blue, where there's black and white, where there's Hispanic and Asian Americans, where there's men and women, and we're all taking action to serve the least of these in our city? Wouldn't that be a counterculture? Like actually doing something, actually giving money, and we're not doing enough, but we want to do things. And we have raised thousands of dollars for people who don't have SNAP benefits. And I don't want to steal Ben's thunder, but we're going to fight for the common good, and Ben's going to talk to you about how we're going to do another foster care makeover this month. And we'll talk more about that later. But what if we took action? Wouldn't that be beautiful? Wouldn't people see our good deeds and glorify God in the day of visitation? Man, amazing. All right, next thing. So fight for the common good. Next thing is fight with surprising agency. Fight with surprising agency. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God, honor the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only those who are good and considerate, but to those who are harsh. It's a very difficult passage to read in a nation that had, horrible slavery for 400 years. Very difficult passage, but I want to show you something. And that's this. Every time you open your Bible, you are a time traveler. You are traveling backward in time. And it can be shocking, right? Shocking to read these words. And if this elicits emotions in you, that's understandable and that's okay. But we're time travelers. And what ancient people saw as shocking is very different than what we see as shocking. Because what shocks us is here's an apostle telling slaves to submit. And we've already clarified the fact that he wasn't like some rich aristocrat. He was a poor person. But what would have shocked ancient readers is not the call to submission. What would have shocked ancient readers is the love and dignity and worth he gives to slaves. And I'll prove that to you. Ancient Romans had something called the Hausfel, which were household codes. And they would write these codes and they'd say, tell your slaves to get in order, tell your wives to submit, tell these people this is how you should run your household, the patriarch of the family. They would never directly address slaves. But in this letter, flashback earlier on in the chapter, look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10. Peter has just called slaves a chosen generation, a special people, and a royal nation. Imagine you are living in the Roman Empire and you are property. You could be executed any moment. And somebody tells you, no, you're royalty. You're a chosen people. You're a royal nation. You're a chosen generation. In the philosophical writings of Aristotle or Plato, they never talk to the slaves. Slaves are animals. You don't talk to them. Here he's writing to slaves directly. And what is he saying? He's saying, guess what? Christ, what does Christ mean? Christ is a Greek word for king. Your king suffered just like you. Your king knows what it feels like to suffer when he doesn't deserve it. Do you think you're ever going to read somebody writing a letter saying, hey, slaves, suffer just like Julius Caesar suffered for you? Do you think anything in the ancient world is going to say, hey, slaves, suffer just the way Plato suffered for you? No. Do you know how dignifying that would be as a slave to receive a letter like that? It would be ennobling. Now I got to show you what this kind of talk accomplished. This is a quote by Varro. Varro said, as a Roman scholar, contrast is the mother of clarity. When you contrast the Bible with other ancient writings, you get clarity. Contrast is the mother of clarity. The only difference between a slave, a beast, and a cart is that a slave can talk. Okay, now check out, this is Chrysostom, and you could also look at all these Bible verses, by the way. There's actually one in Corinthians that says, hey, slaves, if you get the chance to become a free person, do it. That's pretty cool. There's amazing stuff in all those verses, but I'm going to read you Chrysostom. He's quoting from Colossians and Galatians. In Christ there is no slave, that's Paul. Therefore it is not necessary to have a slave. Buy them, and after you've taught them some skill by which they can maintain themselves, set them free. Time escapes me, but I could show you dozens of quotes. I could tell you stories about Melania, a woman who's a saint, setting thousands of slaves free. I could tell you about Augustine and Octavius and all these Christians doing it. Gregory of Nyssa is the OG. I can tell you a lot about all these guys, but I just want to put that before your eyes. Now, a question could rise in your mind. Why did it take so long, though, Jesse? The 4th century? Why did it take so long? I'll tell you why. Because at the beginning of the 4th century, as late as 303, Diocletian, the emperor, was burning all the writings of Christians, executing the pastors, and persecuting them. They couldn't talk about overthrowing the empire. They couldn't talk about overthrowing the empire and overthrowing slavery while simultaneously being hunted down for their lives. But the moment Christianity gets dominance, they start abolishing slavery. Want to know what's crazy? Slavery disappears in Europe until the transatlantic slave trade. And mark my words, look it up for yourself. Want to know what the slave drivers in the transatlantic slave trade primarily did? They didn't quote the Bible, they quoted Aristotle. They quoted Plato. They went back to the Roman and Greek way of looking things during the Enlightenment. So that's a lot to say. But now I also want to make this personal, because you're like, okay, that's good. Christians are anti-slavery. Stoked on that. But I want to make this more personal to your own lives. And if you want more on that, I have a document that I've assembled that's like 30 pages of every verse in the Bible about slavery and a lot of quotes from church history and a lot of quotes from ancient people and all that. But so if you want that, you can stay for the Q&R after church. But I want to make this more personal. And I've heard good sermons on this that do talk about employee-employer relationships. And 40 hours of your week, unless you're self-employed or unemployed, is devoted to employer-employee relationships. So I want to share a bit on that. And, a lot of us feel like this. I'm going to tell you my favorite rhyme. My favorite rhyme is this. Boss makes $1, I make a dime. I'm watching Gossip Girl on company time. That's my favorite rhyme. I love that rhyme. But a lot of times in counterculture, I talk about how your career can become an idol. It can become an excessive desire. And that is a real thing. Can we go back to the agency point? Yeah, the agency thing. I talk about, how work can become an idol, and that is true. But it's crucial that you can do your job to the glory of God and excel. You can excel in your career to the glory of God. You can and you should, and this passage says that you must. And I want to tell a story from my personal life, and I'm just telling this story because I think it's relatable, and it's kind of a time when I was walking in a lot of people's shoes. But in 2020, Becca and I, we, like many other people, were horrified by some of the events happening. We were very vocal about the lingering ramifications of slavery. We were very vocal about the lingering ramifications of segregation and lynchings and redlining, and also what Native Americans and Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans have in this country. And the church that I was working at, just a boss that I had there, pulled me into his office and told me I was a disgrace to the pulpit and told me that I was humiliating the church. And, so after months of prayer and wrestling, we resigned from that church, and I went and got a job at a restaurant. And lest you feel too bad for me, because I'd been in ministry since I was really young, Becca said I was like a Kardashian pretending to have a job. but I really did take like a $20,000 pay cut, all right? So I'm like working at a restaurant and hustling in the pandemic, wearing a mask. And I had people, they knew I was a pastor, and I told them, hey, I may work at this restaurant. I may have just taken a $20,000 pay cut. I'm not working on Sunday mornings. Jesus is first in my life. I will not work that time. Even if that means I don't get the job, well, they agreed to it. And so I was able to go to Sundays, but I'd be there and, people be coming up to me and I'd be like, hey, how are you doing? I'm so glad that you're here. I want an avocado toast. That's what life was like, and maybe that's relatable for you. And my coworkers would make fun of me and call me pastor boy and say the most nasty sexual stuff to me and just crazy. It's just like a normal day out in the world for most people. And it was gnarly. But why do I tell you all this? Is that I worked as hard as I could to do that restaurant job to the glory of God. And at the end of my time there, my coworkers were in tears crying as I left that job. The one who always sexually harassed me, he was actually really funny and hilarious, but that guy, he told me I was the kindest, nicest person he'd ever known. Both my managers told me I was one of the best employees they've ever had. And I don't tell you this to make myself sound great. I tell you this because God can make you great. When you do your job to the glory of God, you can excel like Daniel. You can excel like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you can put God first. And I think there will be times that you come in first. I believe that. Our final thought this morning is, we can bring the band back up on stage, is fight trusting the true judge. Fight trusting the true judge. It says, when they hurled insults at him, Jesus did not, your king, your master, did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges righteously. And what Peter's goal, and what we saw with those quotes from Chrysostom and whatnot, is Peter's goal was to get them to melt the empire through the love of God, not try to smash the empire with the empire's own methods. His goal was to get them to melt the empire with the love of God, not smash the empire using the empire's own methods. And so he gets them to imitate Jesus. And he goes, hey, I know you want it. Maybe you want to spit in your master's face. Maybe you want to punch him in the face. Maybe you want to, try to kill him in his sleep, right? But he goes, no, look to Jesus, who on the cross, he trusted himself to the Father, the one who judges righteously. The decision to not get revenge, the decision to not retaliate, the decision to not use violence. Peaceful protest is great. I'm all on board with peaceful protest. But the reason why we don't become violent is because when you try to use violence to overthrow Babylon, you become a Babylonian. You're putting yourself in the place of God. You're saying, I know who deserves justice and who doesn't. I'm perfect. I never make mistakes, and I should be the judge, jury, and executioner for all those sinners out there. But what the Bible tells us is that not that we just lay passively and do nothing, but we refuse to take the methods of Babylon in our own hands. We refuse to put ourselves in the place of God. And what has been liberating for so many Christians throughout history is the promise that justice will eventually come. That no sin goes unpaid for. That's what communion says. Communion says no sin will ever go unpaid for. God takes justice so seriously that he took it on himself. Here's the thing. We have a tendency to want justice and judgment for others, but grace for ourselves. But the whole world's like that. Every human being's like that. We want justice and judgment for others and grace for ourselves. But on the cross, Jesus made a way to accomplish both. He said, I'll take the justice so that you can have the grace. And the Bible promises that if people don't accept the grace at the cross, that there will be judgment in the second coming. And that has provided hope for people throughout history, and I'll prove it to you. Want to know how I know that this has provided hope for oppressed people throughout history? Because Desmond Tutu, check this out. Desmond Tutu, we're back where we began. People don't know this when they quote him on their little signs or on their Instagrams. Desmond Tutu was an Anglican bishop. If you want to keep people subjugated, the last thing you do is put the Bible in their hands. There's nothing more radical, nothing more revolutionary, nothing more subversive against injustice and oppression than the Bible. We were inspired not by political motives. No, we were fired by our biblical faith. And through his nonviolent protest, He dismantled apartheid along with Nelson Mandela, who was also a Christian. Amazing, right? So here's what I want to say, and I know I'm going a little long today, forgive me. But we want to rid the world of billionaires in Portland, but Jesus wants to rid our hearts of greed. We want to ban the sex industry on the right, but Jesus wants to banish lust. We want to take out corrupt politicians in Washington, but Jesus wants to take out the corruption in every soul. We want to kill our masters, but Jesus wants to eliminate our desire to dominate. We want to take out the opposition, but Jesus wants to eliminate hate. You know what's going to purify our souls of anger? What's going to purify our souls of anxiety? What's going to purify our souls of fear and hate is looking at the shepherd who takes injustice so seriously that he bore it himself on the cross. So we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have communion passed out, but I'm going to leave this verse on the screen. And as you take communion, just take some time and meditate on this passage. Meditate on how Jesus loves you when you're unjust, and that when you trust him, you can love other people who are unjust, and then trust him that at the end of the age, he is going to dispense final justice perfectly. So let's meditate on Jesus bearing our sins in his own body.